I know it's been a while since our last video, and I also know that it's almost the end of January, but Happy New Year everyone! Today we're going to be reviewing the brand new Chorus Fire line of paddles. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I've got a bit of bad news. I've been nursing an ankle injury for a few months, and unfortunately that injury has gotten to a point where I can't really play pickleball at any normal capacity right now. I've had to hold off with the reviews while I rehab it. I still can't put that much weight on my right ankle, but there's so many paddles coming out right now that I've started thinking of ways that I can review without actually moving around the court too much. You're going to see with the footage today that it's pretty different to how I normally play. Instead of game footage, I decided to just go out there and drill, and I think I did come up with a pretty good system for testing. I did some work in the kitchen, I hit drops and resets from the mid-court and the baseline, I hit volleys, I hit drives, I even did some half-court kitchen games, and I actually think I got a pretty good feel for what these paddles have to offer. The footage itself won't be the most exciting that I've ever put out, but for now it's the best I've got, so hopefully you still enjoy it. Now we're going to get into the Chorus Fire specs here in a second, but first, as usual, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. Alright, so let's go over some specs now, and I'm actually going to talk about all three of the Chorus Fires today, so the EX, HX, and SX, but I did spend a lot more time on court with the EX because I do tend to prefer elongated paddles. That said, these paddles all have a similar feel and playability to them. The only differences come from the actual shape, and I'll talk about what that means throughout this review. But when I'm talking about spin, power, and control, things like that, they all feel similar. Now let's start with the specs on the EX. The E stands for elongated. It's 16.5 inches long, it weighs 7.8 ounces, and it has a 1/16 swing weight with a 6.2 twist weight. The core is 14 millimeters thick, so obviously pretty thin, which makes sense considering these are meant to be power paddles. And by the way, all three of these paddles have that same 14 millimeter core. Moving on to the HX, the H stands for hybrid. It's 16.2 inches long, it also weighs 7.8 ounces, and it has a 1/13 swing weight with a 6.4 twist weight. Now this isn't your classic hybrid shape, it is a little bit more square than what you'll find from Vatican 6.0 and even Chorus's very own shapeshifter. Now finally we have the SX, which I don't have with me right now. The S, I believe, stands for short. This paddle is 15.8 inches long, so yes, very short. It also weighs 7.8 ounces, and it has a 1/10 swing weight with a 6.7 twist weight. I didn't actually play with this one, but I did take some time to hit the ball back and forth in the store with my coworkers. Again, I'll refer to it throughout this review, and then at the end I'll explain which one of these three will work better for different types of players. That's it for the specs. Now let's go over the technology going on inside of here, because it is very interesting. Chorus is claiming that these are power paddles, but they're also saying that these aren't going to be the most powerful paddles because there isn't any sort of trampoline effect going on inside of here like we get with foam paddles. So less power than those, and they are being very honest about that. But they're also claiming that these are going to have more durability and consistency, which I am totally inclined to believe because I think at this point we all know that foam paddles do change a little bit over time. Now instead of using foam, they've engineered their own unique power technology, and it starts with the core. This has what Chorus is calling their wide cell power core. This is a honeycomb core with wider honeycomb cells, and what that's supposed to do is create more power the harder you hit. I know that sounds a lot like a trampoline effect, but it actually feels very different, and I will talk about this a lot more in the feel section. Moving on to the outer layers, there are actually 3 sheets on top of the core. First, you've got a layer of fiberglass, and then you've got a blended carbon and polyester twill weave. Polyester twill being what a lot of companies were calling titanium in the past. Obviously, at this point, we all know that it's not actually titanium, but it's the same material you've got in the Shogun, the J2TI, and a few other paddles as well. Underneath that layer is where things get very interesting. There's another full layer of carbon before the core, but this carbon is very flexible, and that's supposed to maximize rebound action. At least that's how Chorus is putting it. When I read that, I thought, okay, that's obviously there to increase dwell time, which is very interesting. So there's a lot of exciting technology here on paper. Now let's talk about how that all translates into feel. The feel on these Chorus paddles is very unique, and as you might expect with all these different materials here, there are actually quite a few layers to the feel, no pun intended. Right off the bat, even as I was just bouncing the ball in the store, these paddles feel extremely firm. They're some of the stiffest paddles I've ever tested, and they make this really sharp, almost metallic pingy sound. I think you'll be able to hear the difference here. Like I said, I felt that just bouncing the ball, and then it was the same thing when I was warming up in the kitchen. On any shot that involves a really slow stroke where you're not accelerating the paddle face, they feel almost rock hard like a board. Now I really need to insist that this stiff feel is only when you're hitting softly. That's because when you're not putting a lot of force into the ball, you're only hitting into that top layer, which is the fiberglass and carbon titanium blend. You're not punching all the way into that softer carbon mid layer. Obviously, a paddle that feels stiff when you're hitting soft is going to impact its performance in the touch game, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the control section. But now we're going to talk about that second layer of feel. As soon as you accelerate the paddle face, even just a little, you tap into that softer carbon layer, the one that's underneath that fiberglass and then carbon titanium blend. This takes very little force, just a little bit more paddle face acceleration, and you get this undeniably plusher feel, which is really interesting, and honestly actually a little bit surprising because most of these adaptive paddles actually get stiffer the harder you swing. So when you're hitting a shot that requires a little more depth, so a drop or a reset from farther away than the kitchen, or even if you want to add a tiny bit of spin, anything that involves more force, you'll start feeling that plushness. This is really cool, and it adds a super unique element to the control game. Again, we'll get more into that in the next section, but now I want to talk about how this feels when you're swinging fast. Once you're swinging big, so on drives, powerful volleys, on big serves, anything like that, you still feel that longer dwell time thanks to that carbon mid layer, but then as the ball exits the paddle face, you feel it firm up quite a bit. It's not a trampoline effect, but I can understand how that wide cell core helps extend dwell time, but also provide energy return because the power here is excellent. Again, we will talk about that more later. So there are 3 layers to the feel. Super firm on soft shots, and then a longer dwell time once you apply a bit more force. And then when you're hitting big, you still get that longer dwell time, but it's backed by quite a stiff response. What stays consistent throughout all these layers is that the actual feel on contact is muted and a little bit metallic, and I've felt this before with other paddles that have this carbon and twill weave blend. It's definitely not my favorite feel. I prefer something that's a little bit more connected to the ball, like Chorus's Shapeshifter, for example. The good news is a muted feel usually means a pretty big sweet spot, which these paddles definitely have. There's very little contrast between how the paddle responds when you make good or bad contact, so in that regard it is a big sweet spot, but it's not necessarily a forgiving sweet spot, especially in the control game, so let's get a little bit more into that. I know these are power paddles, but I wanted to start with control because in some parts of the control game they're excellent and in others not so much, and it all kind of comes back to these differences in feel. When you're dinking or hitting any touch shot that doesn't have to go too deep, you apply very little force onto the ball. That's when this paddle is so stiff that it provides very little dwell time, and it's actually quite difficult to control. I honestly felt like I was fighting the paddle a lot of the time that I was using it in the kitchen. It doesn't have a random or ambiguous launch, but it's so stiff that you can't really feel the ball in the paddle face. This is also why I was saying that this paddle might technically have a big sweet spot, but it's not really a forgiving sweet spot. It just feels a little harsh with very little feedback, so you can make poor contact and still push the ball in a semi-good direction, but it's so stiff that it's probably still going to punish you either with a pop-up or the ball's just going to go out. So this definitely isn't a paddle that's made to be elite in the super soft game in and around the kitchen, but once you step away from the kitchen and you're hitting shots a little bit deeper, you tap into that plush carbon layer and its soft game performance becomes so much better. Now I'm talking specifically about drops and resets where you naturally have to apply a bit more power to get it into the kitchen. I was having a really easy time hitting these shots. You can see here I'm drilling from behind the baseline and most of my shots are dropping in perfectly, and this might be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but I almost felt more confident hitting these shots than I did with my dinks. It's just those little nuances in feel and dwell time that end up making you feel more dialed into the paddle, which gives you an extra sensation of control. It's still not the best paddle even in this part of the touch game, but honestly I'm kind of happy that it's better for drops and resets than it is for dinking because those are obviously much lower percentage shots. I can work around the stiffer feel in the kitchen. Once I'm used to the paddle, I probably won't have problems with its stiffness, but when I'm in these more random situations, that's when I really need to lean on the paddle's inherent control qualities. Again, not the best, but it is pretty good for control considering how stiff it feels at first, and that's just testament to this really impressive construction here with that soft carbon mid layer. Now let's talk power because this is a very powerful paddle. but it is quite different to a lot of the other super popular power paddles nowadays. Most power paddles now have some sort of trampoline effect. Obviously the Ripple, the Yolas, the Gearboxes, they have foam, but even the Pickleball Ape's Pulse, once you break it in, it has a little bit of spring effect to it. I decided to bring all those paddles to my playtest to see how these Chorus Fires compared, and there's definitely no spring effect here, but they are still extremely powerful. Now in terms of pop, so the power you're looking for when you can't generate a full stroke, it's excellent. Because they're so stiff, the ball spends very little time in the paddle face, so it doesn't lose any of its energy. It pops out instantaneously, you don't need to swing too hard, you can even just stick out the paddle and block a ball back, and it will redirect that pace very efficiently. Because of that, it's excellent for speed ups, or even if you have to react really quickly to a pop-up or an opponent's powerful volley. This is an excellent paddle for ending points quickly up at the net. If you do decide to swing a little bit harder on a volley, you still get tons of pop. It does feel a little plusher because you're tapping into that mid layer, but there's still a firm exit point that punches into the ball. I will say this is where you start to feel that these are maybe a little bit lacking compared to spring effect paddles, but compared to Gen 2 thermoform paddles and even Kevlar paddles, they have noticeably more pop. Now these paddles are also excellent when it comes to power when you're swinging big, so drives, serves, and putaways, and that actually surprised me a little bit. At this point, most stiff paddles are powerful just because of the nature of thermoforming, but adding more beyond that usually requires a little something extra like a trampoline effect. Again, there's really no trampoline effect here, but the way they've combined the longer dwell time with that soft carbon and the wide cell core and then firmed up the exit point, that creates a very powerful feel. It's a long dwell time backed by a stiff wall which punches into the ball. It just feels like this paddle is this really efficient conductor of energy from your stroke through the ball. Now the biggest difference between these and foam paddles is that foam paddles launch the ball hard and deep. You get that similar hard pace here, but not as much depth. I kind of like that. That depth on foam paddles can make them feel a little bit uncontrollable at times. The fact that you get that pace without the depth, I think a lot of advanced players may actually really appreciate, but I still have to say in terms of top end power, foam paddles have a little bit more. When I first felt how firm these were just bouncing the ball on them in the store, I have to say I was a little bit worried about spin because nowadays the best spin paddle have at least a little bit of dwell time because that's how you generate shape onto the ball. The good news is spin is excellent here, even soft spin, because to generate spin you have to move the paddle face quickly and that involves tapping into that plusher mid layer. Now it's definitely not the grabbiest soft paddle that gives you a ton of purchase over the ball, but for me it was more than enough to hit spinny drops, which I really appreciate because those are such difficult balls to pick up for your opponent. The only issue I had in the soft spin game was that slightly muted metallic feel. Spinny drops are difficult shots, so I like to be as connected to the ball as possible because that's how I become super confident in my paddle. Now spin when you're hitting hard is excellent, although I wouldn't put these in the top tier of spin, but it's more than enough to control their power. I was getting plenty of pop off the ground with my drives, which is good because that pushes my opponent back a little bit so they can't use my ground strokes as a springboard to come into the net. I was also getting tons of spin on my roll volleys, which is great because the more spin you can generate up there, the lower you can get to hit your volleys because that spin will loop them over the net. That also makes up for these paddles' slightly lackluster soft game because instead of just continuing a dinking rally, you have a much easier time punishing your opponent if they pop it up even a little bit. Now let's talk a little bit about the differences between these three paddles because all those differences basically come down to swing pattern and maneuverability, and that plays a big role in the spin game. The EX provides a ton of stability and punch onto the ball, but it's also the least maneuverable, so it's the most difficult to kind of roll over the ball, especially when you need to react quickly up at the net. The SX is kind of the opposite, where you get a ton of easy spin because it is so easy to roll it over the ball, but then the punch and stability aren't quite as high. The HX is really the best of both worlds in that it still feels like it has great power and stability, but also way more hand speed than the EX, so it's a true hybrid paddle despite not looking the same as most other hybrid paddles. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about who the Chorus Fire paddles are made for and which one of the three you should choose. First of all, who's going to like the way all three of these paddles feel? Well, they're going to be for those of you who want really powerful paddles but don't want to go all out for those slightly uncontrollable trampoline effect paddles. These have excellent pop, and actually all three have pretty good hand speed relative to their lengths, so they're great for those of you wanting to play offensive up at the net but wanting something a little bit more consistent than foam paddles. Go for the EX if you want the most power on drives and you don't have a problem maneuvering elongated paddles, although again, it's pretty quick for such a long paddle. You can also try adding weight to this one because that will make it even more stable and actually a little bit softer in and around the kitchen, which could be perfect to boost its control up there. Go for the SX if you want one of the most poppy and maneuverable paddles right now. This one is perfect for anything that involves quick reactions and putaways up at the net. Finally, go for the HX if you want the best of both worlds in terms of pop and power, and then really good maneuverability. Although, as usual, when you go for a hybrid paddle, keep in mind it won't be the very best at either. I think personally, because these paddles have such a muted feel, that I'm not going to use them all that much, but I did really appreciate this amount of pop and consistency. Foam paddles are obviously amazing, but they can feel a little bit inconsistent, especially with the way foam breaks down over time, and you won't have that here, so I think Chorus have done a really impressive job with the engineering on these paddles. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo the Chorus Fires, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.